Please note today's session is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. Thank you very much, and on behalf of the National Cancer Institute, I wish to welcome everyone to the Advanced Topics in Implementation Science webinar series. We are excited to be joined by our speakers, but before we get started, a brief word about logistics. We ask that if you are not already on mute to please keep your phone on mute for the duration of today's presentation. As mentioned, this session is being recorded and muting all lines will help us to avoid any background noise. We encourage questions. They can be submitted by using the Q&A feature on the right-hand side of your screen. Type your question in the provided Q&A field and hit submit. Feel free to submit your questions at any time during today's call. And with that, I'll turn it over to David.
Well, thank you very much to Sarah for kicking us off. And if you are tracking the slides, for which there will be few, you should now see the lovely pictures of our invited guests today for a topic that I know is of great interest to our community, just seeing unparalleled registration numbers, and we're looking forward to being able to speak with many folks on the line. As Sarah had said, these fireside chats that we have are really driven as much as possible by the questions that you all have, the comments that you want to make, and the ways in which we can drive an informal discussion about topics of particular interest to our community. This one, focusing on qualitative research methods in implementation science, was something that a few years ago, Suzanne Hurton-Roberts, who you'll see in the first picture next to me on this slide, had come and said, you know, while we've had a lot of growth in qualitative methods, we really haven't as a field come together to try and take a look at what methods can be critically analyzed and made available to address a range of different topics in implementation science. She enlisted the next two folks who you see listed on here, Larry Palinkas and Alison Hamilton, into this effort, and they, along with others, produced a really wonderful white paper in an effort to try and guide the field toward better integration of qualitative research methods. That's really the focus of today's discussion. And we're so grateful to have all three of them, wonderful experts, wonderful anthropologists, all three of them, and strong contributors to our research community. Just another note to say that we sadly are wishing a fond farewell to Suzanne Hurton-Roberts at the end of this week, as she is moving to the next stage of her life and her career beyond the National Cancer Institute. And we just want to thank her for all of the wonderful work that she's provided to us all over the last 21 years. But this is the sweet part of it, because we really get to delve into one of those passionate areas for which we've seen a lot of growth, and thanks much to Suzanne for that. So again, we'll start with a few overarching questions, but we'll be taking a look at what comments you put in, or what questions you have in the question and answer field, or if you're trying to send chats, ideally through the Q&A field, and integrate them as we go. But first, just wanted to give our invited experts a chance to talk a little bit about how each of them first became interested in implementation science more generally, and then specifically how they decided to focus on advancing qualitative research within implementation science. Why don't we start with Suzanne, and in the order that you'll see depicted here, we'll go Suzanne, and then Larry, and then Allison. So Suzanne?
Thanks, David. I've been here at the NCI for quite a while, and when I first came, I was intrigued that there was an office of what then was called, I think it was diffusion and dissemination, or something like that. And John Kerner and Cindy Vinson, who's still on our team, were involved in that. You know, they were essential to the office. I thought, what a great idea that people are thinking we should actually do something with the research we have. And then there were the conferences that began, the D&I conferences. I went to the first one. I think I've only missed one over the years. And every time I went, I thought, I want to do that. Until finally I asked to get myself transferred over to the team, and I'm very happy I came. So that's why the focus on qualitative. Well, I'm an anthropologist, and of course I do qualitative research, among other things, but also after I was after I got into D&I, I looked at the literature some, and I was a little frustrated that some of the qualitative research could be done better. It seemed that people were doing things out of habit not everybody. There's great stuff that's done in implementation science, great qualitative and mixed methods work. But some things just were done over and over again because that seemed to be what people were used to doing and not necessarily what the methods that were the best ways to answer certain research questions. So I think that's really what got me involved. First, I was interested in qualitative research, and then looking at the research that was being done, I started questioning things.
Great, thanks. Larry, your initial interest in implementation science and then how you decided to focus on advancing qualitative research within it?
Sure. Well, it all actually came together through an introduction and long-standing association with John Landsberg, who at the time was director of the Child and Adolescent Services Research Center at Rady Children's Hospital in San Diego. He reached out to me initially because of my expertise in qualitative methods, but more specifically, my ability to kind of translate qualitative methods in mixed method formats, particularly to people who were quantitatively trained, knew nothing about qualitative methods. Shortly after that introduction, he had me partner with Greg Ahrens in doing a study in Oklahoma where we combined qualitative and quantitative methods for the purpose of studying the implementation of a program that was designed to minimize out-of-home placements in child welfare systems. And then subsequent to that, John was able to get funded for a P30 NIMH Advanced Center that focused on implementation research methods. I was attracted to implementation science largely because I saw it as really addressing the issue of impact, that it went beyond, particularly from my training as an anthropologist, from understanding a phenomenon to actually doing something about it and making it happen. And I think that's why it appealed to me. And because of my background in qualitative methods, I felt that I had something to contribute to the field as well. So that combination of things, I think, is really what brought me into the field.
Great, thanks. And Alison?
Yeah, thank you, David and Suzanne and Larry. I feel like I got into this field before it was really a field because in the late 90s, several of us were doing substance abuse treatment research and looking specifically at what we would now think of as the implementation of standardized evidence-based treatment models in community-based clinics. So I was doing that work before there was really a field of implementation science. And one thing led to another, and I started working at the VA with Alex Young and Amy Cohen, and we were interested in looking at uptake of evidence-based practices in specialty mental health, and had Alex and Amy got query funding to do one of the first hybrid type 2s before there was really such language, or maybe it was language on a poster that Jeff Curran had done many years ago. But, we were doing that study and really trying to understand both effectiveness and implementation. And it was one of those right place, right time stories for me, in that, I was at the VA when Brian Mittman was doing a lot of his foundational work with Cypress and with implementation science, the journal, and just, was able to kind of grow with the field as the field was growing, which I'm really, just have benefited so much from, and so honored to have been part of that initial development. And I think in terms of the qualitative piece, originally we were just conceptualizing, let's do interviews. Things have advanced so much since then, and it's been so great to work with Larry and Suzanne and our colleagues on these topics. And I think for me, just the fact that it seems like from the inception of this field as a field, it's been one where you can't do it without qualitative, which I hadn't really encountered before. So the thought, number one, that qualitative was absolutely necessary to do this work, and number two, that there was a really special place for anthropologists in doing this work has just made it a great fit for me.
Wonderful. Thanks for the introductory comments, and you'll notice if you're following on along on the slides that not only is there a lovely fireplace, but you'll see a guitar in the background, signifying our interest in integrating music into implementation science as well. Like to move on because we specifically saw earlier, a number of months ago, the release of the Qualris report, and I thought it'd be helpful for Suzanne and certainly then Larry and Alison to talk a little bit about their experience as part of this Qualris initiative. Before we get to that, I think Sarah's going to just make a note.
So if you're following along on the web meeting, the chat function, you can send us a message, and also you can find resources. So if you are looking for a quick link to that Qualris white paper, it is already in the chat function.
Okay, great. So Suzanne, do you want to tell us a little bit about how the Qualris Initiative came about, and then we can hear a little bit about Alison and Larry's desire to or choice to be part of it.
Okay, yeah. Actually, it's been this was based on some long-term discussions. Alison and I have been for a long time working together on the idea of integrating anthropology into implementation science. And of course, methods came up into that. So those discussions have been going on for years. I think that the Qualris project itself, probably around 2014, I was thinking of this. I was fairly new to implementation science, first time doing an implementation study, which was My Own Health Report, the MOOR project that Russ Glasgow had headed up. And it was my first time doing an implementation study, and I found myself in specific situations that I hadn't before, trying to pull together qualitative methods for the project and analysis and so on. And we'll talk about some of those specifics later. I don't want to get into that too much right now. But I was looking for guidance. I looked to the literature for guidance on what to do because this was different from things that I'd done before. And I couldn't find any guidance. There's plenty of guidance on how to do good qualitative research. But in the context of implementation science with the issues presented, the situations you find yourself in doing implementation science, there was really very little, if anything. I first started talking then with Larry Palinkas and Borsika Rabin, who had been working on measures. She was part of the measures group in implementation science. And we started talking about the need to put together some sort of guidance. Brought Alison into this at the pretty much the same time, and we built a group of experts, some in qualitative methods, some in implementation science, and some were experts in both. And what we've been doing, the way we worked, was we wrote, we did literature searches, we worked on our own, drew from our own experience in our own publications, and it took a good bit of time to put this together. It was definitely a group effort, and finally we were able to get it together in October and get it on our website. So it was a process that started with frustration, and then action was taken by a number of very interested and very qualified people to produce the paper that's in existence now on our website.
Wonderful. And we have two of those people
Yes.
with us today, in addition to Suzanne. And I wonder if Alison and then Larry could talk a little bit about how you saw the Koalas Initiative, what you thought it could accomplish, and how far it's gone in your mind to this point. Alison?
Yeah, sorry. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Actually, if we could have Larry go, just because I have a bit of a cough, I'm just going to grab some water. I'll be right back.
Sure. We are nothing if not flexible. Larry, you want to jump in?
Sure. Well, you know, when I first saw the list of names that Suzanne was inviting to be a part of this group, it quickly became apparent to me that she was inviting all the cool kids of qualitative methods and implementation science. And how could I not be, you know, a part of a group like that, or turn down an invitation to be a part of a group like that? But, you know, when Suzanne first explained the whole Koalas Initiative to me, it was clear that she was concerned, and, you know, a number of us have been concerned about trying to educate people about the importance of qualitative methods and implementation science, especially when, you know, to the degree that qualitative research has always been given a status of research evidence that is not quite at the same par as quantitative methods. We felt that that kind of education was very important. But I also saw two other advantages to being part of a group like this. The first, it was not only a matter of educating the broader field of implementation science as to the benefits of qualitative methods, but it was an opportunity to sort of brainstorm amongst ourselves about how we might innovate the types of methods that were available, how we could get beyond simply doing semi-structured interviews or focus groups, to doing something that was truly innovative methodologically, and in so doing, how we could advance the field of implementation science through those methods innovations as well. So that was the appeal of the Koalas Initiative to me.
Great. Alison, do we have you back?
Yes, I'm back. Sorry about that.
No.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, this has just been, you know, such an incredible opportunity to put together 10 like-minded people and really explore all the different ways that we've had to adapt and adjust our methods in doing this work. And you can tend to feel like, you know, I'm the only one who might be struggling with this, or the only one who is having to adapt and tailor a bit. And then you realize you're not. And, you know, the innovations that Larry mentioned, we've been able to share those and also propose some directions that we think the field is going in, seeing an increasing sophistication in the application of qualitative methods in implementation. So to be able to be part of thinking about that, getting feedback from our very illustrious group of reviewers and advisors was excellent for our process of coming up with a white paper that we, you know, hope is of value to the field. So I think, you know, given each of our respective career paths and contributions to both methods and implementation, it just created this really nice kind of constellation of comments and observations and suggestions that we really tried to infuse into the white paper.
Great. Thanks so much for that, all three of you. And I'm seeing questions, and thanks to those of you who are already typing them in, because we do want to take as many as we possibly can throughout. I wonder if this is a good chance for each of you to take a minute. I think you've each alluded to innovations, you know, newer methods that are now being used, or at least are candidates for use across implementation science. I wonder if each of you might take us through an example of how you've seen qualitative methods advance in recent years, and particularly how they might relate to implementation science. Suzanne, do you want to start?
Actually, I think I'd rather hear from Larry and Alison first. Some of the most exciting cutting-edge developments in qualitative methods are coming out of the VA out of necessity because of the situation that VA researchers find themselves in. So I'd like to hear from Alison and Larry as well. I could only probably give you general ideas in the sense that things have gotten much more rigorous, much more sophisticated in general in qualitative research, and more varied than we had in the past.
Okay, sure. So, and then you can chime in on top of that. So, Alison or Larry, you want to start?
Sure. I'm guessing Larry and I will think of some similar innovations. We've just wrote a paper about this, especially innovations in mixed methods research, which really characterizes probably the majority of implementation research is mixed methods. So I think that's one area where we're seeing a lot of innovation is in how to truly integrate qualitative and quantitative methods in mixed method studies. In other words, not having them run parallel to one another, but really be mutually informative and setting up the studies, the design, the analysis, et cetera, to be able to achieve an integrated set of findings that wouldn't be possible without the mixing of methods. So there's been a tremendous amount of growth in that area. I think another area where we're seeing a lot of innovation is in the application of ethnography, which, of course, for us as anthropologists is really exciting and just opens up a whole field of inquiry that I, wouldn't have anticipated when we started doing this 17 years ago or however long ago it was. So, for example, we had an ethnography panel at the D&I conference. We'll be doing another version of that at the Academy Health conference. And, some of my colleagues are using qualitative methods as implementation strategies. So I think there's a realm of this work that really has to do with the application of qualitative methods in ways that we, at least as anthropologists, we're not necessarily trained to apply them, and everything that goes along with that. So the implications of using qualitative methods in a proactive way, in a way that can really direct the course of studies, using ethnographic methods in ways that, we weren't doing at first, but that we're seeing so much more work in, and Larry's done some excellent work in this area as well. So those are some of the things that I see happening that I think are incredibly exciting and rich and challenging.
Great, thanks. Larry, chiming in on innovations as you've seen it in qualitative methods?
Sure. So as Alison just mentioned, there have been a number of innovations that I've seen that bring together qualitative and quantitative methods in mixed method formats or designs that have been increasingly used in implementation science. Concept mapping is one that comes to mind. There's also now a version of the RE-AIM outcomes framework that integrates qualitative and quantitative data. Laura Schroeder just came out with a paper a month or two ago looking at ways of conducting analyses of qualitative data that sort of minimize the time involved in qualitative data analysis. Another innovation that I've seen increasingly used that has great potential in implementation science is qualitative comparative analysis that takes qualitative data and either solely or along with quantitative data can identify clusters of predictors of implementation outcomes and then use a particular outcome measure of implementation or sustainment to see which cluster best fits or best predicts that outcome. One of the areas that I've been working with increasingly, along with my colleague Doug Zatzik at the University of Washington, has been to sort of bring together rapid assessment procedures, which is a technique that has been used by anthropologists, particularly in healthcare policy and practice, along with clinical ethnography, which is a traditional version of ethnographic research methods, but typically conducted in a clinical setting. And through that combination, use them together in examining process and outcomes of implementation in pragmatic trials. Many times these are funded through PCORI, but they're really intended to minimize the burden on study participants on the one hand, but also to reduce the amount of time it takes to both collect and analyze data. So RAPIS, which stands for Rapid Assessment Procedure Informed Clinical Ethnography. Excuse me.
I was going to say we have a question, but it's hard to interpret.
I know. I'm trying to explain to her. She needs to type it in the Q&A box. Anyway, techniques like this, I think, have a way of, not only moving beyond the traditional forms of qualitative data collection and analysis, but to address very specific challenges that come with doing implementation. So whether it's the focus of the site or setting in which the research gets done, the logistics involved in collecting and analyzing data, and then how that information is used to give us a better understanding of not just of the challenges that we face, but identifying the most likely solutions to those challenges.
Cool. So another question that just popped up from someone is, I think, lots of interest certainly in trying to learn more, and we'll continue the discussion, but the question is whether any of you know of specific training opportunities focusing on qualitative methods in implementation science. Are there any in the country that might be for junior faculty in particular? Any courses, any resources, any thoughts to address this particular question, training opportunities on qualitative?
So I teach, this is Alison, I teach that exact topic, qualitative methods in implementation at a summer, it's called the Qualitative Research Summer Intensive, which takes place at UNC Chapel Hill in July. It's a 2-day course. I've taught it there a few times. I'm teaching it this summer. So we do cover a lot of what we've talked about already, and it's sort of a combination of a little intro to implementation science, because there are people who come to that workshop and haven't really had that foundational training, and then a more specific focus on the use of qualitative methods. So that's one that's very specific to that. And then, of course, there are broader implementation science trainings available that will incorporate qualitative methods, along with many other aspects of implementation science.
And Larry, any other training opportunities you know of?
Well, certainly, as Alison just mentioned, within broader implementation science training programs, in the past, I've given presentations and provided technical assistance to trainees in the use of qualitative methods. So the Implementation Research Institute, for example, I've participated in some of the summer workshops in the past. In the tighter training sessions, I've done a similar service. Oftentimes that has created associations with trainees for longer term training or exposure to qualitative methods, which I've certainly provided. I do know that in the past, in addition to the training in qualitative methods within implementation science like Alison has provided, the National Science Foundation has also provided training over the years in qualitative methods, much of which I think has value for implementation science. So Russ Bernard, who is at the University of Florida, Jeff Johnson, who's now at the University of Florida, were directors of that summer institute. It used to be held in North Carolina. I'm not quite sure if that's still in existence. I believe it is, but there are programs like that that can offer training in qualitative methods that would be of value or use in implementation science.
Great.
And as an NIH opportunity, OBSSR does support a mixed methods training opportunity in conjunction with Hopkins and a couple other universities. And so I would encourage you to Google mixed methods plus your resource of universities to see what pops up for the trainings that have been mentioned so far.
Yeah, and also thanks to one of our participants who noted that Penn also has a 2-day qualitative course in January. Suzanne, anything to add on that?
Well, I did want to remind people that if you haven't seen the white paper yet, the white paper does give a very general overview of qualitative methods and at least a sense of what the basic premises are. The literature, the references that go along with the paper are extensive, and some of the key references in qualitative methods and in mixed methods are included in there. So I would definitely familiarize myself with the paper too. I think that would be helpful.
Great. Thank you. Another question that popped up, I think, is asking whether any of you might give an example of questions that you think would be, around in the context of implementation science that would be particularly well answered through qualitative research methods. So, do any of you have a couple of examples for people to think about?
Sure, absolutely. This is Alison. Let's see where to start. I mean, I think I've had kind of context on the brain these past few days, and I think one of the reasons why qualitative methods and people who specialize in those methods, such as anthropologists, other social scientists, are really a good match for implementation is that we do have a way of thinking about and looking at context and assessing and evaluating context, which tends to be to some extent immeasurable, changing, could be chaotic. So just ways of thinking about how do we even account for context and how can we do that with qualitative methods, I think is one of the most important and rich contributions that qualitative methods make to the field. For example, in terms of understanding the context, the climate, the culture that one is going into when you start an implementation project. How do you characterize, people's knowledge, attitudes, and beliefs in those settings? What's the nature of, their receptiveness to change, things like that. And, oftentimes using mixed methods to assess, do that sort of diagnostic analysis, as Stettler said many years ago, of the settings where implementation is meant to occur. And that would be something you would continue to look at throughout the life of the project because, of course, the context is changing, and you want to, make sure to keep an eye on what's happening with context, climate, culture as your project progresses. I think two other big things, and I'm sure Larry and Suzanne have a lot to say about this as well. Two other things that we're often in the position of using qualitative methods for are to understand what's happening during the implementation process. So we know things don't usually, if ever, go as planned. So what is happening during the course of implementation with the key players, with the implementation strategies, with the intervention itself. And those are questions that we would definitely use qualitative methods for. People's attitudes toward the intervention, toward implementation, how things are changing over time. And I mentioned implementation strategies. I think this is another area where we are seeing a lot of application of qualitative methods in terms of understanding adaptations and tailoring that's happening during the course of implementation, and the sort of flexible use of implementation strategies, and how can we understand that from a qualitative and perhaps also quantitative perspective. Those are just a handful of the things that we would look at with qualitative methods, and I could go on, but I would love to hear from Larry and Suzanne on this as well.
Thanks. Larry, a couple additional thoughts on that, and then Suzanne?
Well, certainly, Alison mentioned using qualitative methods to understanding process, and that's probably one of the two major reasons why I use qualitative methods in my implementation research, because it gets at the question, how? Not necessarily does it work, but how does it work? And that's something that oftentimes quantitative methods alone doesn't really provide you with an understanding that qualitative methodologists often refer to as in-depth or deep understanding of a particular phenomenon. The other use of qualitative methods that I've been predominantly involved with is answering the question why. So many times, particularly in a field like implementation science, where we're in the process of generating theories, moving beyond diffusion of innovation to looking at other components of the phenomena of implementation and sustainment, that qualitative methods can be very good at generating hypotheses that ultimately could be tested using quantitative methods, but that developing a theory or a model which could be then tested, not simply a framework or list of potential predictors, but a better understanding of how those predictors operate to create a specific outcome. One of the areas of implementation science that I've been particularly attracted to is the kinds of interactions and relationships among the various stakeholders in an implementation endeavor. And I'm not just talking about systems leaders and clinicians, but also researchers, policymakers, and practitioners. Those kinds of relationships can only partially be understood through quantitative methods. There's nothing like sitting in at a meeting and observing the kinds of verbal and nonverbal communication that occurs to give you an understanding of both the assets that a team has with respect to implementation and perhaps some of the challenges as well. And then more recently, I've been looking at qualitative methods, not just as a way of collecting data and understanding the phenomena, but actually influencing that phenomenon in much the same way that all of the implementation strategies that have been developed over the years are designed to facilitate implementation. So, for example, qualitative methods are very good for engagement of study participants, building trust with community partners, but they're also a way of influencing the process of implementation and hopefully increasing the likelihood of a successful outcome.
Thanks, Larry. Suzanne?
Yeah, just quickly want to add that you can use qualitative methods. You should, I think, at the very beginning of designing the study because, as Alison said, it's important to understand context. And without understanding context, it's difficult to decide on an implementation strategy. So I think the use begins in the design of the implementation trial and continues throughout in various ways and various areas.
Great. Thanks. Pulling up another question that popped up, which comes up a lot, is the issue of how we think about sample size for qualitative studies. And the questioner says that they're working on a great pilot study, but the sample size is small. There's 7 provider interviews, 7 community stakeholders, and that ends up being all of the possible service providers implementing the intervention. Can any of you talk a little bit about how one tries to balance saturation with any sort of perceptions of what appropriate sample size would be?
Well, what I've noticed over the years is sample size is often a function of convenience, something it shouldn't be, but that usually is. There may only be so many people available to be interviewed or observed or to participate in a focus group. There is, I guess, standards that people have used or estimates that people have provided in the past at which the likelihood of saturation is relatively high. And so depending upon the reference that you use, it can be anywhere from 13 to 16 if you take Guest et al., or 20 to 30 if you take other sources of information. In the end, the ability to reach saturation, of course, depends on how rich you want the information to be, and how much variation there's likely to be in the sample that you're selecting. So when you think about the purposeful sampling that occurs in identifying the people who may be the most knowledgeable, the most informative in providing you with information on a particular topic, you may get differences depending upon whether you're sampling for variation or you're sampling for homogeneity. So that it may be that if you're sampling for a common set of themes or topics within a group, you may need a smaller sample than if you're sampling for variation when you are looking at differences in those themes among subgroups of a set of participants.
Great. I'm seeing so many wonderful questions that I want to get a chance to at least have one of you be able to respond to each of them. So I'm going to move on to another one. We had talked a little bit about training opportunities domestically, but one of the questions that came up was if you know of any that might reach more of a global audience. And the challenge being that sometimes certain courses are quite expensive. Is there any advice that you might have for somebody who might be in elsewhere, I guess, an international setting, and what kinds of opportunities, either through distance learning, online kinds of things, or anything that you know of that might be, for example, in Africa?
I think it's a great question and something that we need to get better at.
Yeah.
I don't know. The training opportunities that I'm familiar with internationally are kind of specific to some training programs, some NIH-funded training programs that I'm on faculty for, but they're, kind of specific to the folks who are in those programs. And we can share resources later about those programs. In terms of trainings that are more broadly available, I don't know the details, and maybe Suzanne or Larry knows, but like, for example, the UCSF implementation science training is an online training. I'm just not sure about its availability internationally. Do either of you know?
No, I don't know. I don't know anything about that.
The other thing that I know, the MOOC, which is a online course. Massive online something course. Yes. I know that a few years ago there was an effort to create a MOOC for implementation science, and I don't know the current status of that, but I know that that was an effort to try and bring it to a broader audience, and it would be a question as to whether qualitative methods are incorporated into that.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one of the difficulties.
That's a great idea.
So just to tack on to that, thank you for the participant who sent me this chat. That UCSF course, the University of California, San Francisco Implementation science training certificate can be done online and includes some qualitative methods, and it is available internationally.
Great, thanks.
I was just going to say that implementation science encompasses a lot of different approaches, and internationally, people aren't necessarily doing what they're calling implementation science. They're doing knowledge transfer, knowledge exchange, and so on. So a course in that would specifically relate to the sort of work that's being done in a particular locale. So what's done in Canada isn't necessarily going to be relevant to the kind of work we do here in the U.S., although we're talking with each other more and more.
Okay, thanks for that. Another question is how have each of you, and maybe we'll just choose one respondent among the three of you, how have you successfully communicated the advantage of using qualitative and mixed methods to those who might otherwise be skeptical of why context even matters? I presume that at some point in your storied careers, you've had someone who say, why does it even matter? What do you say in response?
Larry, you want to go, or do you want me to go? We could both probably do
my
that.
experience has been, it's amazing what you can illustrate through qualitative methods and the way that you communicate it to someone who's had little or no experience with such methods. So, for example, I was in a meeting last week with a pretty well-known psychiatrist, mental health services expert, and his research team, and they were conducting a study which they had collected a number of qualitative interviews, and they're sort of summarizing the themes for me. And as typical with people who aren't that familiar with qualitative methods, what they came up with is a list of topics, a list of themes, many of which were actually driven by the questionnaire itself. And in the process of my asking questions about what they found and noting, certain connections between those themes, we actually began to draw out a conceptual model of how this particular phenomena operates. In this case, it had to do with interventions to minimize the risk of loneliness in older adults. And they were stunned by it because they never really saw, qualitative methods being diagrammed out in a way that enabled them to see the connections between the various bits and pieces of information that they were collecting. So while they may have, intuitively thought there's some value to doing this, they weren't entirely sure what that value might have been. And being able to sort of show them through pictures actually made a big difference in helping them understand what can be learned through qualitative methods.
Great. Let me jump ahead to another. There's actually a couple of different questions that I think speak to any advice that any of you have in terms of grant writing. And so the question is, so there's sort of two different questions, and I'll ask maybe Alison, if you wanted to kick us off with just your thoughts on sort of either or both feelings. So there's the more general question about whether you have any specific tips for incorporating qualitative methods as you're, within implementation science for grant applications. And then a more specific question, which talks about how might you balance the need to use qualitative methods to understand context before you get to the point of deciding on an appropriate implementation strategy, with the need often, as you're writing the grant application, to write a grant where reviewers are going to have the faith that the intervention is already well-defined and thought out. So how do you try and balance that need potentially to do more discovery prior to that point in the study where you would select something versus when there's an expectation that you've already done that work? Any thoughts there, Alison?
Yes, a lot of thoughts.
Great.
A great question. I mean, I think it's really helpful from the more general question, and which relates to the more specific question, just to think about the phases of your work and when qualitative methods are going to play a more or less prominent role in any given phase. We tend to see in a lot of study designs that they would play an important role in the early phase. We might think about that as preconditions, pre-implementation. It kind of depends on what framework you're using, but that period of time before anything is actually happening and in motion and changing. And so from a broader grant writing perspective, there's that intentionality behind choosing your methods according to what you're trying to achieve in each phase of the project. In terms of the balance question, I think for me, choosing frameworks that are pretty explicit about understanding the context before you actually go in and try to change anything are extremely helpful. So doing that thorough assessment of the climate, culture, context, and saying, you know, at this point, before we've done anything, we think some implementation strategies that might be important based on prior work, our prior work, other people's prior work would be X, Y, and Z, you know, using the fantastic rubrics that are available to help us think through a plausible set of implementation strategies, but then indicating that according to what a framework would suggest, like replicating effective programs, for example, according to what that framework would suggest, we're still going to explore whether these actually make sense once we get started. So you're sort of giving your best estimation of what you think will be important, what you're going to try, what that initial package looks like, and it's very important to specify that to the best of your knowledge and your team's knowledge, but then give yourself the flexibility and time and methods to be able to figure out, you know, which strategies work when, how are you going to figure that out, how are you going to document and track that. So I think there's, you know, it's always the idealized version that we propose, and, you know, using an approach that really emphasizes tailoring and adaptation can help with that process of figuring out what's going to make sense where.
Great, thanks for that. Another question that popped up, more specific, but I wonder if any of you might want to address the use of qualitative methods to inform discrete choice experiments. Any takers on that?
Well, you know, I can certainly say that oftentimes prior to the design of experiments like this, you know, researchers engage in a process of what are called cognitive interviews, where they identify both the language as well as the parameters of an experiment using qualitative information. So essentially, it's an opportunity to conduct relatively, well, less structured interviews to identify the parameters, and then more structured interviews to identify the details of the experiment itself. The idea being that in such an experiment, the scenarios that you're presenting are understandable, for one thing, and the outcomes are going to give you meaningful data on the other. So that would be an example of where qualitative methods play a very important role in the design and execution of techniques like discrete choice or other quasi-statistical or statistical applications.
Great, thanks. Thanks very much for that. I wonder, there was another question that was just talking about, as you've been, again, more specifically related to writing grant applications, but do you have any advice, any pitfalls that applicants often find themselves falling into when they're trying to describe qualitative components of their studies or a qualitative research design overall that you might want to encourage people to avoid? So your reviewer hat on.
Yeah, I mean, probably there are a few, but if I were to pick a pet peeve, it would be a lack of specificity around the analysis plan. So, people go to great lengths typically to describe their methods. I would always encourage some draft interview guide questions, especially if, pretty much across the board, but especially if your project is heavily qualitative, just as we would expect to see descriptions of quantitative measures, we need ideas about how the team expects to operationalize their qualitative data collection into actual interview questions. So that's a strong indicator that a team is thinking about that, is ready to do that. And in the absence of that, it makes me very nervous. And what we see in strong proposals is the thorough use of some type of conceptual or theoretical model, of which there are many to choose from. But what happens often in the analysis section is that the specificity isn't sustained. So there's sort of a general, we're going to do thematic analysis and we're going to use Atlas, and there isn't a clear plan that's well aligned with the methods that have been laid out, especially when it's an integrated mixed methods proposal where you'd actually expect to see an integrated mixed methods data analysis plan, not just here's what we're going to do for quantitative and here's what we're going to do for qualitative. So for me, the stronger applications have an analytic plan that really reflects what domains are going to be examined in the qualitative data collection, how they're approaching, site level differences, role differences, really getting into the specifics. So in other words, there's no boilerplate language, which I have been asked for in the past. There's no boilerplate language for a qualitative analysis section, and it's really critical that the details and the nuances of an analytic plan for your qualitative data would be comparable to what you would provide for your quantitative analyses.
Great, thanks, Alison. I did want to. We've had a couple of people whose interest has been particularly piqued. You had used earlier in the conversation, you'd referenced fantastic rubrics and frameworks that you would feel like would be helpful for setting people up, and I think in the context of studying context and culture. And the follow-up question was whether you had any specific frameworks that you might recommend people to take a look at. What would you rely on as far as conceptual frameworks?
So I have some resources that I'm happy to share that are kind of, to me, and I would guess all three of us have sort of essential readings. And I would refer to papers that help folks think through what frameworks are going to work for their particular projects, depending on what level they're targeting, what the nature of the intervention is, et cetera. So rubrics that I was thinking of before were the rubrics around selecting and specifying implementation strategies. So a lot of Byron Powell's work, Enola Proctor's work, and her and colleagues' paper on writing implementation proposals to me is just, indispensable. And similarly with the implementation strategy papers that really help us think about how do we specify what we're using, when, why, how much, et cetera. But if there's a way to share a couple of those lists, I'm happy to do so.
Alison, I will absolutely, if you send those to me, we have in the past, because there are so many resources that have been shared, have compiled a list and made that available on social media. So there will be a link. So if you want to send this to me, I can get them online shortly along with our archive. And because we are at the top of the hour and so many of you have stayed on, I want to go ahead and say thank you to David, Suzanne, Larry, and Alison for their time this afternoon, and to all of you for joining us in incredible numbers. A quick note that your feedback is important to us, and we encourage you to complete an online evaluation. A link to a survey will open in the window once this session has concluded. An archive of today's session will be made available on our website. And again, I will do my best to get those resources on social media or available via link as soon as possible. Thank you again for joining us. We hope that you'll join us in April for our next Advanced Topics webinar. You can disconnect at this time.
Yeah, thanks everyone so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
It was a pleasure. Bye-bye.